Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Planet in Focus 2020, our first ever virtual edition. My name is Julian Carrington, and I am a programmer with the festival. I very much hope you enjoyed our opening night selection, The New Corporation. I'm delighted that filmmakers Jennifer Abbott and Joel Bakan have been able to make time to join us in what must be a whirlwind of a schedule for both of them. In addition to The New Corporation, Jennifer is premiering a second film this fall called The Magnitude of All Things, which is also part of the PIF selection. And Joel has just released the companion book to the film. So Jennifer and Joel, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The original Corporation, it's such an iconic documentary, and it was hugely popular on its release. As well as somewhat rarely for a doc, feeling evergreen. The context may be different, but I think that core takeaway, the diagnosis of corporations as psychopaths who put profit above all else, I think that still really resonates. So I'm curious to begin with, what was the catalyst that got you thinking it might be time for a follow-up?
Well, I started to think about it around 2013, 14. I was sitting in a 10th anniversary celebration of the first film. We rented out a theater, had a big party. And as I was watching it, I was thinking to myself, I'm not quite sure what we're celebrating here, because every single issue that we looked at in the film, whether it's climate change or the corrosion of democracy or growing inequalities of race and economic and gender, all of these things are worse, and corporations are bigger and they're more powerful and they have more sway over society. And yet at the same time, they're telling us that now they are the solution to the world's problems, no longer the cause of those problems. And so I started to think, in terms of the psychopath metaphor, it was as though the psychopath had found its charm. And that is basically the idea here in The New Corporation, is that these institutions haven't changed fundamentally. And as a legal scholar, I can tell you that the law that makes them is exactly the same as what we diagnosed as producing a psychopath in the first film. But around 2005, around just shortly after the first film came out, corporations really started changing their game and really started saying, we're the good guys now. We're going to solve the world's problems. We get it. Maybe we were acting like psychopaths. Maybe you got it right in the first film, but we're different now. We're on the road to recovery. So trust us. And it was really that combination of things around 2014 that led me to think it was time for a sequel.
My experience is very different from Joel's in the sense that I actually was like, no, I do not want to make a sequel. And I think partly that's because of the role I played in the first film. I co-directed with Mark Akbar, but I also edited the first film. I didn't edit this film. Good time to shout out to Peter Rowick, who did. But I edited the first film, and really, I cut that film from 400 hours of footage. And it was just a monster of a film. Did I want to make another one? And in many ways I had felt it was some of the best work I had ever done, and I just wanted for it to stand alone. And also I was deep in the trenches of making another film, The Magnitude of All Things. But for me, the triggering moment was when Trump was elected, and it's not as if everything suddenly changed then. I see Trump as a symptom as opposed to really the cause of many of the problems. Certainly he's exacerbating them. But it was when he was elected, the veil came down. There was no illusion anymore that corporations and government were acting independently, and they were, they had the gall to rig the system in plain view now. And for me, it was that moment. I felt there were compelling reasons to make a sequel.
Yeah, Jennifer, I think your reluctance is slightly betrayed by the title, The Unfortunately.
Yes. Well, that's more not really about me personally. It's more, I know you know that, but it's not a personal reflection. It's more like it really is. It's actually tragic. Really, it's tragic that it's so bad that we felt we had to. Yeah.
Indeed, yeah. I recall seeing some early pitch material for this film that invoked the concept of Stockholm Syndrome, sort of in continuity with that diagnostic theme of the first film. And Joel, you mentioned, one of the inspirations for wanting to tell this story is, I think, a desire to interrogate the sincerity of this new sort of socially conscious veneer that corporations have assumed. So I'm really interested in that idea of probing into this relationship that, in the wake of the first film, there seemed like there was a pivot, and now we have kind of let our guards down a little bit and cozied up to corporations and brands again. So maybe can you expand a little bit on that idea?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, when you look at the Stockholm syndrome, it's a syndrome whereby a victim, usually in a hostage taking, falls in love with the perpetrator, the criminal who is taking them hostage. And the idea is that that person feels in some ways so dependent, so powerless, and the captor, it turns on the charm and tries to give a sense of why they're doing what they're doing and the rightness of their cause, and that somehow the individual victim gets seduced into believing that. So in a way, the Stockholm Syndrome is a particular instance of how we get seduced by people who have ill intentions in relation to us, and often people who are psychopathic or who are at least amoral or immoral. And so it did seem like a good metaphor to use here, but it really became kind of difficult when we got into the weeds of it, because we tried to find some consensus definitions among psychologists and psychiatrists, and we couldn't find those. Everybody had a different set of criteria. It was questionable whether it was really a syndrome at all. So it started, and also the whole idea of society being captured, like in a hostage situation, seemed in some ways hopeless. I mean, too extreme in a way. And so, yes, we did play with that idea, and we played with other ideas too. We eventually settled on just the very simple idea of a playbook. And the leading play in the playbook is this idea of seducing society into believing that corporations are there to serve society and serve people and serve the public interest. And we look at this in the film. In the book, I go into a lot more detail about just how deliberate and organized a campaign this was, beginning around 2004, 2005. It is just a marked shift in how corporations are presenting themselves. And so, it's very seductive for us as citizens to look to corporations and say, oh, well, they seem okay now, and that's good. And so we can kind of let our guard down. But in the meantime, what corporations have been doing is leveraging that patina of goodness to push for more deregulation. Hey, we're good now. You don't have to regulate us. We can take care of the environment on our own. We care. To push for more privatization. We're good now. Let us run your schools. Let us run your water systems. To push back taxes on corporations. We're good now. We shouldn't have to pay taxes. We'll deliver goodness in other ways rather than paying taxes to government to be good. So it's been a full court press against government under the guise of goodness. And to a large degree, a lot of us have found that compelling and have found it seductive. And I think one of the main purposes of this film and this book is to try to break that bubble. And that's why we go to Davos, because Davos is really the heart of this idea. And that's why the film basically, that's kind of the first big scene in the film for that reason.
Jennifer, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I really think Joel covered it well. Yeah. Other than that, we were calling Davos the Magic Mountain.
I think the playbook structure does allow you very naturally to encompass a really wide breadth of topics. And in particular for Planet in Focus, I imagine that the growing urgency of the climate crisis was also probably a significant catalyzing factor in terms of your feeling like it was time to tell an updated story.
Oh, absolutely. I think, we are at this critical juncture, and related to climate change, it's a crisis now, without question. We know that we're in the midst of it, but the trajectory we're on, are we going to continue on that trajectory? And temperatures rise in addition to 4 degrees and live on an uninhabitable planet. So I think that we feel very strongly that we needed to include it, and I'm really proud that we did, and we included it in several different ways. And I think it's kind of remarkable, actually. I remember seeing Robert Reich's film Saving Capitalism a few years ago, and it didn't even touch on climate change once. And to me, that is just a remarkable thing. And I mean, I'm with Amitav Ghosh. He wrote that book, The Great Derangement, which really just says, how can any piece of art, any piece of culture, film, book, not at least reference the climate catastrophe in some way? I mean, it is that big. I mean, it is the end of the Holocene. It is the beginning of a new world. It's the end of the world as we knew it. So but I do feel that the scale and violence of it is just so big. It's very difficult for people to wrap their heads around. And, I think I'm really happy that the way we ended up integrating it into the new corporation.
Joel, did you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, I just, I agree with everything Jen says, absolutely.
You guys have got this down. You both give such,
yeah, the only disagreement pretty well was doing the sequel.
To begin with, right.
Got it. Well, in talking about some of the factors that you felt sort of compelled you to revisit this topic, unfortunately, many of those were sort of trending in the wrong direction, in worrisome directions. But I think since the first film, we've also seen, for instance, the democratic socialist movement gain in mainstream credibility in a way that probably was not anything we would have predicted upon the release of the first film. What have you guys made of that development?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's no coincidence at all that the kind of narrative storyline in the film as you get to the end, and I don't want this to be a plot spoiler, but one of the
people will have seen the film.
Of course, that's
by
right.
the time of this Q&A, so spoil away.
All right. Well, you would have seen then how we kind of developed a storyline from Occupy to local politicians coming out of the Occupy movement, like Shama Sawant and Ada Colau in Barcelona, who came out of the Los Indignados movement in Spain, which was a precursor to the Occupy movement. Saying basically, it's not enough anymore to just protest. It's not enough to be in the streets and the squares. What we need to do is we need to occupy government office. And then after that, you see Bernie Sanders and you see AOC, other democratic socialist candidates and green candidates around the world, in Iceland and New Zealand, socialist green candidates. And I think that that is an incredibly hopeful storyline that you can trace from the anti-globalization movements that were happening around the time we made the first film, and we covered them in the first film, through Occupy, where people started to say, it's not enough just to march through the streets and protest. We need to kind of create in these squares, we need to take them over and then create what we think democracy should look like in a participatory form. So we need to go beyond protest to proposition. And then we need to go beyond that to actually doing that in democratic institutions and taking them over and making them work in a truly democratic way, all the while continuing to protest, all the while continuing to occupy, but adding this new layer that in many ways I think activists had neglected, at least since the 60s, of kind of large P politics, of institutional politics. So I think, you know, I mean, yes, it's true that Bernie Sanders didn't win. Joe Biden is the Democratic standard bearer, but I think there is within the Democratic Party a very, very strong voice for a more progressive movement in terms of environmental and social issues. And I'm actually very hopeful, not only at the federal level in the United States, but at municipal levels, in state legislatures, and around the world, really, of this kind of new hybrid kind of democratic politics that tries to meld activism and electoral politics. So yeah, that is a very hopeful thing. And you're absolutely right to observe that as all these sort of bad things were happening, there's just been this groundswell of resistance, but not just saying no to that, but saying, here's how we think things should look. The Green New Deal is the perfect example of that.
Mm. Yeah, Jen.
I was just going to add that, you know, I think the flip side of what Joel was speaking about is, you know, and something we interrogate in the film is, you know, what is our relationship to government? And, you know, I think, you know, we've really been conned into dissing government and, you know, the aspiration for democracy in some ways through neoliberalism and corporate ideology that is trying to shift our perspective, our perception, so that we start to think of corporations as the institution that can save us, save society, protect the common good, when really, you know, it's a democratic institution that is our best shot to, you know, to represent the people, to act for the people, to act for the common good. And we've really, through a neoliberal ideology and orientation, been, as I say, conned into really, you know, into that aspiration for democracy being in many ways abandoned. And we're so cynical about government. Now, I'm not saying for a second government isn't at times completely corrupt and evil, and often is, but the aspiration for democracy is something that, you know, we really feel should be held up. And another idea that we explore in the film.
So we've talked about resistance movements, we've talked about the possibilities of democracy. I'm wondering, within corporations, you know, the film offers examples of individuals like John Brown, who seem reasonably earnest in their desire to do good, but who at the end of the day remain beholden to the profit motive. Do you think there is a viable way forward within the framework of corporate capitalism, or is that something that that can only lead to bad ends?
I mean, I think the central argument of the film and the book, and it builds upon the previous film and book, is that the corporation is an institution with a very particular institutional imperative and dynamic and character, that is created by law, and that the law basically requires that managers like Lord John Brown or Jamie Dimon or anybody else, CEOs and top management, have to always put the interests of shareholders first. And so to the extent that they can pursue social good, to the extent that they can pursue environmental good, it always has to be a means to an end of generating profits, generating growth, and generating shareholder value. And so to that extent, despite whatever good intentions, and this is what we're trying to show, I think, with Lord John Brown, he does seem sincere in caring about safety. But when you look at his record, he only cared about safety to the point where it would cut into profits. And he didn't care about it when caring about it would have basically diminished profits. And that's not to take anything away from him personally. It's to say that if you're a CEO of a company, that's what you do. Right. You have to justify everything in accordance with that model. And, you know, an analogy I like to use, it's like a lawnmower. A lawnmower has a certain character to it. It does a certain thing. It cuts your lawn. It cuts grass. You don't want to use it to give yourself a haircut. You don't want to use it to make a smoothie in the morning. You don't want to use it to vacuum your living room rug. And a corporation is the same. It is not a fungible institution. It's a very predetermined, legally defined institution. And what it does is it creates wealth for shareholders. So everything else comes second, if it comes at all, and it has to be a means to that end. And so what does that mean for people within corporations? What can they do? You know, they can try to push the envelope, and you know, some corporations are better than others at doing that. Some CEOs are better than others at doing that. But the real problem that I have with the whole new corporation movement is that it is deliberately being rolled out as a way of governing society. It's basically corporations saying, because we're good now, we can take over from government. We don't need to be regulated by government, as I said before. And I think one of the most chilling parts of the film is where one of the champions of this new corporation movement, Richard Edelman, a sort of major business guru, probably one of the most influential in the world, is standing in Davos, and he says, in the interview, he says, I'm not much of a believer in political citizenship. I believe in the power of the marketplace. And I think in that statement, you get an encapsulation of what's going on, which is that big business has in effect given up on democracy. Not that they were ever that committed to it, but they can now just baldly say, you know, Jen was talking about how things are just out in the open now. It's just out in the open now in big business circles that we're the good guys now. We can take charge because we're good now. And so government, you know, look at them around the world. They're not working. They're falling apart. They're becoming populist and right wing. And so really leave it to us to take the lead on social and environmental issues. And that's a very, very scary trend. And I think it's more important to be sort of looking at that than asking the question of, you know, are these really good people in corporations? Of course they are. We're all good. We're all doing the best we can. But it's the institutional structure of this thing. And it's this dynamic of it leveraging goodness in order to take more power and control in society that I think we really have to be aware of and wary of.
Jen? That about covers it?
That's good.
Yeah, okay. I think, you know, the film, obviously, it feels remarkably up to the moment. You incorporate the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the recent resurgence of racial justice protests, and that must have required you to sort of scramble a little bit in the edit. Why was it so important to you that the film capture these developments?
Sure, and yes, we had to break picture lock twice, which is a pretty big deal, but both Joel and I felt absolutely it was imperative to include both those things, obviously, with the pandemic, you know, for three main reasons. One, it completely laid bare the injustices of the system that we had explored. Two, and perhaps most importantly, it really showed us our humanity. It showed us that we didn't always have to put the economy first, that we could put human life above the economy. And also that, you know, I mean, we all know this, but we are so reduced by corporate ideology, which focuses on those parts of ourselves that are individualistic and consumeristic and, you know, out for only ourselves. And I think it really showed us our caring and altruistic sides, which was important, I think, to model at this moment in time. And third, and it's a very, I think, neglected part of the narrative of the pandemic. And I was really, we both were very insistent on including the fact that the destruction of nature and the destruction of habitat, which we link to, in part, to corporate capitalism, is indeed the reason that these new diseases are emerging. And in addition to, of course, intensive animal agribusiness, which sometimes plays a role, but as habitats are destroyed, pushes non-human animals in closer contact with humans, and diseases that are benign in them jump species, sometimes an intermediary host, to us, and this is what happens. So, you know, we have a headline in our film, and I think it's a, you know, it's right on. It's not hyperbolic. You know, stop the destruction of nature or face more pandemics. And it's part of the discourse that I don't see being discussed to the degree it really needs to be. And then with regards to the uprising, you know, it was, again, we broke picture lock to include, we only had 2 weeks to include it.
Wow.
But, and, you know, really it was so important. It's not that we are a current events film, not at all, but both of these, the pandemic and the uprising, such instances of momentous change. And with the Black Lives Matter uprising, you know, just the beauty and the truth and the numbers and the effectiveness, and that, you know, corporate capitalism was being called out for its racist roots in slavery and colonization, and colonial statues are toppling, and Angela Davis is saying she could never have imagined this in her lifetime. And it was just such a challenge to the system. So systemic racism, but the system, right? Like, why do we allocate so much money to the police and military, and why are our, you know, hospital workers wearing garbage bags? You know, so it was such a challenge to the system. And again, it just, you know, to not have included would have been such an error. And for me, its inclusion, because of its power, really transformed the film. Because the corporate behemoth is so big and feels so, you know, like solid. And yet here we have this uprising that has been so successful at challenging its core. So for me, it really transformed the film. And when we included it felt like it was authentically hopeful, right? Just not trying to be hopeful, but like authentically hopeful.
I think, you know, I'm mindful of time. You've both been very generous. So maybe finally, I'll just ask, on that note, what does give you hope at this moment? And for those who, you know, have watched the film here and are now wondering what sort of steps they themselves can take, do you have any guidance?
Yeah, I mean, I think what gives me hope is that human beings throughout history, and Michael Hart says this in the film, you know, no matter how bad things get, people struggle. And they struggle for a more just world. They struggle for a more sustainable world. They struggle for a world that can be a world that you know, isn't going off the edge of a cataclysmic cliff with climate change. And so we're seeing the school protests as we show. We're seeing indigenous peoples around the world rising up, not just to defend their land, but to promote a sustainable agenda, and one that is consistent with the kind of cosmology that many indigenous peoples around the world share, one of relationship with Earth rather than exploiting Earth. We see the Pope saying the same thing, basically, that we need to be in a relationship with Mother Earth. We see this throughout South America, the Andean people, Pachamama. I mean, so there's just so much going on around the world. Concerns about workers' rights, concerns about human rights, the sort of re-enlivenment of democracy that we show in the film, that it's hard not to be hopeful. And I think, you know, it's also hard in the how many minutes we have left to tell viewers, you know, here's what you should do. And I think rather than saying, you know, here's the exact thing you should do, I think what we need, what I would rather say is, think about the concept of citizenship. Think about what that means, not only in terms of your rights, but in terms of your responsibilities. Think about the limitations of acting as a consumer. You are not going to save the world by driving an electric vehicle and buying organic food. I'm not saying those are bad things, but as we try to make clear in the film, and as I go into quite a lot of detail in the book, those kinds of individualized, somewhat random and voluntary responses by consumers are really just a corollary to the individualized voluntary responses that corporations want. It's part of the same piece of relying on markets to solve these mass problems, when what we need are collective solutions. We need collective solutions, and our main institutions for collective solutions in the world today are democratic governments. And so we need to get them to work the way they're supposed to work, which is to require corporations to respect environmental and human goods and rights, not to sort of hope that they will, and to believe that markets can solve the problem if consumers are responsible and corporations are responsible. That's a myth, and we need to be aware of the fact that it's a myth. So think of what you can do as a citizen, and think about the limits of what you can do as a consumer. I think that's a place to start.
Jen, did you have any last thoughts?
Sure, I'll just add that, for me, hope, I'm with Cornell West and Joanna Macy and others, that hope is a practice. Hope is a verb. It's hopeful that even if we're in complete despair, we still get out of bed in the morning and do everything we can, knowing how important this moment in time is. And so for me, it's really just about echoing what Joel said, that people do always struggle. But if we see hope more as a practice, I think that can sort of activate people. And it's not that we know what the consequences of our action are going to be, right? We'll never know that, and we'll actually never truly know it anyway, because of just the interdependence of everybody and rippling and domino effects, etc. So, we have to just continue to take action because it's the right thing to do as a human. And so that's how I define hope.
I think that's a great note on which to leave things. So thank you both for your time today, and obviously for the film. And thank you to those at home for tuning in. We hope you enjoy the rest of your Planet in Focus experience.
Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to watch the film. And thank you, Julian, and to Planet in Focus.
Ditto gratitude from me. Thank you so much.